think we are all wired up now. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Thomas, and thank you so much to the organisers for inviting me to present on such an auspicious occasion. 100 years of service to the education profession is really something quite significant and something to be lauded. So I do appreciate the honour of being able to talk to you today. Before I do, let me just give you a little bit of my background and where I'm from. Many of you who have been to Perth will recognise the picture of the city of Perth with the Swan River in the foreground. Not quite as many tall buildings as Hong Kong, but we are developing, like many cities around the world, really developing beyond the capacity of the current infrastructure. So that's a problem for Perth. You can see here the city in the background, and there's the river, and this is Curtin University here. So it gives you an idea that it's quite close to the city. It's an inner city area, but there's still quite a lot of trees around. And different to Hong Kong, of course, there's no big buildings in this area. On campus, this is our Faculty of Engineering building. This is our medical science building. We've just begun a new degree in medicine which focuses on rural medicine. So that's a unique approach for many institutions in Australia. This is our Faculty of Education. So we're coming close to home now. And this building was renovated not too long ago. But the deal for the renovation was that there was not enough room in the building when it's renovated for all the staff to have offices in the building. So the deal was, we will renovate your building if you have open plan. So none of the staff in the School of Education have an office to themselves. Even the head of school doesn't have her own office. It's all open plan. But it's a nice and it's a high-tech building, so I think the deal was probably worth it. Within the School of Education, I work within the STEM Education Research Group. Within this group, we have 34 academic people working within different areas of STEM, both in the disciplines of STEM, but also in an integrated STEM approach. And those people do what all university academics do. They research and do development and teach and supervise. This is the way we conceptualise our approach to STEM within the research group. So we tend to put technology and engineering together because I think there's many similarities between technology and engineering. We have respect for the disciplines of science and maths, so these are the independent discipline areas and technology. But where they do all come together, I think is an important intersection. And it's an opportunity, I think, for educators from these independent disciplines to work together in ways that are beneficial for our students. And this all takes place within a digital technology type of environment. So this is the way we conceptualise our STEM research group, as a way of recognising the disciplines, but also recognising the important integration between the disciplines. These are my assumptions today about the nature of STEM. So I'm not going to justify these and I'm not going to argue them. I'm just saying these are my assumptions. So I'm assuming STEM, and these could just as much apply to STREAM or to STEAM as to STEM. So I'm not limiting the application here. So we're talking about integrated subjects. We're talking about a student-centered approach to education. We're talking about students working together, collaborating. I want to talk about something that has a process focus. So the focus is on the processes of what we do. It's not on the end point. It's the process to getting to the end point. A lot of STEM activities are extracurricular, but I think the best type of STEM is within the curriculum. So that's my assumption as well. And referring to the processes, I want to assume that we have a project or a problem-based approach to what we do. So we can argue about these later, if you like, but for now you need to just accept them, that these are my assumptions about the nature of STEM. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some of the research that's been done, which I think we can apply to the pedagogy of STEM. It's not necessarily new research, and it's not necessarily research that has been done within a STEM context, but it's research that's been done about good teaching that I think we can apply to this STEM context that we're working in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these areas and just one or two aspects of research which apply to each of these areas. So let me start with processes. And these are the common, you will recognise these no doubt from the curriculum guides and the literature that is around. These are the common processes which we use within a STEM environment. It's often we talk about problem-based, so the orientation for our teaching is to give our students a problem, and then learning takes place through the solution of the problem, through the process that involves solving the problem. A project-based approach is also quite common, where students are creating something, they're making a project. The traditional approach to teaching science has been inquiry, but increasingly people are talking about using an inquiry approach for STEM. And design also, particularly engineering design, is becoming more common in terms of the process of teaching and doing STEM. So if we think about these, looking at models of the process I think is quite useful. So what I'd like to do is look at a couple of models which represent the process that students go through when they engage with a STEM project. So this is the first model which I really like because I think it represents what students go through quite realistically. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with the game of snakes and ladders. Yeah, we all played this when we were children. We have a starting point, and then we throw the dice, and that determines how rapidly or how slowly we get to our finish point. And you know that some days when you're teaching, your students have very good days, even as a teacher. You have good days and bad days. You have very good days. So when a student is engaged in maybe solving a problem by integrating STEM, everything goes right. And that might be the case where they go up a ladder. You can't predict this. You don't know as a teacher if it's going to happen or not. But this is the way that students learn. You also know that sometimes you're quite close to the finish, but then you have a problem and you're way down the snake again and right back almost where you began. So I think this is a good story for teachers about the processes that students go through. It's complex, there's lots of things to do, but we have a goal, we know where we're going, but the progress through the process to achieve the goal is not consistent. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's slow. There's implications there, I think, for us as teachers. This is another process of a student who engaged in a STEM project and produced a product. So here the student was designing. Here's the starting point, and there it is. There's the ending point. So what I do with my students is when they're engaging in any kind of process, they have to keep a portfolio that documents the stages in their process. And then at the end, they can look back and see what their process looked like. And I ask them to represent their process diagrammatically. So this is the type of diagram that a student came up with. And again, it illustrates some interesting procedural points about our teaching within STEM. It's complex, it's all over the place. And when I have a class of students who all do this, and we compare all their models, the interesting thing, of course, is that they're all different. So even though the students might be designing the same thing, or they might be addressing the same problem, the process that they go through to resolve the problem or to design the project is different with everybody. So I think that's a really important message for teachers as well. All of our students are different. Even if we give them all the same problem, they're all going to approach that problem in different ways. This is an interesting model that was developed from some research that took place in Germany. And again, you have a beginning point, a problematic situation, and an ending point, which isn't really an ending point, because the end says new problematic situation. So you have a problem here, you go through the process of solving the problem, but sometimes you still end up with just another problem, or a new problem. But the interesting thing that these researchers wanted to promote is these barriers here. So these are stages that the students go through, but between each stage is a barrier. There's a barrier for the students to overcome in order to progress to the next part of their process. So the message here for teachers is that the teacher's role is to help the students overcome the barriers. The barriers might be a lack of information, it might be the absence of resources, it might be some skills and some knowledge that the students don't have. But in this idea, this model, the notion or the role of the teacher is to help students overcome barriers. This is quite a common model that if you Google STEM processes, you come up with something like this, where you're improving a solution by a whole range of activities. And there's lots and lots of models like this. But the interesting point, I think, is that if you look at all these models, they all talk about these things. So regardless of what the model looks like, these are the things that the students do in the process of progressing in a STEM activity. We want them all to generate ideas. We want them to be creative thinkers. They need to research and investigate what they're doing. They need to evaluate what they're doing, not just at the end, but throughout the process. They engage in evaluation. They do modelling. They model their ideas. They solve problems, of course, small problems as they go, but also the big problems. They have to document the way they're thinking. Otherwise, as teachers, we don't know what they're thinking. So we have to get them to document their thoughts, and that's our insight into how they're thinking. They produce things, they communicate with each other, they communicate with their partners, partnership forum, so we communicate with our partners, they identify by need. So all of the models focus on these activities. So what are the implications of that? What does looking at that and thinking about that from a teacher's perspective, what does that mean for us? Well, because it's complex, and think about the snakes and ladders again, we can't expect students to achieve that level of complexity by themselves or too quickly. So often I think we expect too much from students. The processes they go through are complex cognitively, they're complex practically, and they're complex because they're putting these two things together. They're thinking as well as doing. So we shouldn't expect too much too soon from our students. And the skills that they need, they do take a long time to teach. These skills students don't just pick up by osmosis. So not only are we concerned about teaching important content, we also have to teach students how to evaluate, how to communicate effectively with each other, how to think creatively. We need strategies of teaching in order to be able to do that. So therefore, we shouldn't try and teach everything at once. So if we're dealing with primary school students, even upper primary or lower secondary students, for them to do a major STEM project it's a big ask of their teacher for them to do that. So we shouldn't try and teach all of these things at once. We should have smaller projects which focus on particular aspects of the process. A project that focuses on research, or a project that focuses on communication, or a project that focuses on being creative. So don't try and teach all of those skills at once. Teach bits at a time. And as students progress then through their educational system, they will build up a repertoire of these skills. So they'll learn different skills from different teachers in different contexts. And eventually, they're achieving the types of goals that we want our students to achieve. And one way, of course, is maybe beginning with a large group. Because in a sense, I'm talking about something here that's very complex, but I'm talking about it in quite a simple way. Because you know, if you have 20 students in a class and they're all doing different things, it can be bedlam. It can be very difficult for the teacher to control and to keep all the students moving up their snakes and ladders. That's a complex task for teachers, but we can rationalise that by dealing with the whole group, having interaction and discussion from the whole class, and then the students will feel ownership about what they're doing. So you're not imposing something on the students, but they've had input into the direction, to the problem that you're dealing with and how to deal with that. So not only are the processes that we ask our students to do complex, they're also quite diverse. So the processes, and you saw this from some of the models, the process we do with our students in a STEM context, it can begin or it can end at different places. We don't always have to have the same starting point. We don't always have to start with a problem or a question. There's lots of different points at which we can begin the process, the learning process with our students. We also need to remember that in all of our classes we have a significant range of different abilities. Not all your students, as you know. I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but I'm just making the point that in all of your classes you have a vast range of abilities. And so whatever you do with your students, you have to ensure that the creative student is challenged at the same time as ensuring that the student with learning difficulties has enough support to progress. So again, from a teacher's perspective, it's a very complex job that we do. So we can begin with a situation, we can begin with a scenario. We can begin with a problem. We can begin with a design brief that we give our students. We could begin with a community need. We could begin with a product. We can say, here is this product, but it's not actually as designed as well as it could be. So let's look at this product, bring all the information we need to create and design a better product. So it could be a product-oriented approach. So there's lots of points at which we can begin this process. And ending it, of course, can also end in different places. So you might end by the students creating or making a model of their ideas, a prototype. Maybe they're designing a system. That might be the end point. Maybe it's some graphic output, which is the end point, a diagram or a sketch or some sort of representation. The point is that it can vary the end point can vary depending on what our goals are. I think we also sometimes forget to remember. We forget to remember. I'm not sure that's the right way to say it. But anyway, sometimes we forget to remember that all the things that we're wanting our students to do, we need to teach them. We get so focused on content sometimes that we forget to realise that these developing young students, they need to be taught how to do the skills as well. So if we want students to learn how to generate ideas, we have to teach them something like brainstorming. How do you actually do it? What's the thinking mechanism that will help you generate ideas? If we want them to research, we have to tell them, we have to help them. How do you design a survey? How do you read indexing to find sources that you need? You want your students to document what they do, you have to teach them how to sketch. You have to teach them how to analyse. You want them to evaluate, you have to give them particular metacognitive strategies to be able to do that? How can they look back on what they've done and be critical of their own work? That's a hard thing for us to do, let alone young kids. So there are certain strategies and skills that they need in order to be able to do that. And the point I mentioned before about our tendency to focus on content rather than process. If we do that, then our students are not able as much to learn through failure. Learning happens through the process that we go through. That's why I'm focusing here on the processes of STEM, because that's where learning happens. It doesn't happen in the final product. It doesn't happen in the final exam. The learning happens throughout the process. And so the learning that we want our students to achieve, it may not be represented by the content. So if we're just focusing on teaching content, that doesn't enable us to give students the opportunity to practice the types of thinking skills that we want them to develop. So we have to have this dual focus. Again, we go back to the complexity of teaching. Content's important, of course. We can't ignore the important content students need, but they need more than that. They need a process through which we can help them manage their own learning. Okay, so that's a little bit of research related to process. Now I want to look at teaching. So what research has been done that will help us get some ideas about our own pedagogy, our own teaching. Teaching for learning is essentially student-centered. We often have many reasons for teaching. We teach because our students need to pass an exam. We might teach because we have curriculum that we have to cover. We might teach because we're following a textbook, and this is what the textbook says. But if we're teaching for learning, we have to be student-centered. So teaching for learning is essentially student-centered. So what are some of the implications of that then? If we accept that that's our focus, what does that imply in terms of our teaching? Well, it implies that the things we get the students to do, they should be significant. And significant means useful, productive, intentional, integrative, and inventive. Those things mean that a student activity is significant. And I think in an area like STEM, which is as wide as the world is big, there's no excuse for not having students engaged in activities that are authentic for them. So we're not talking about authentic for us, of course. We're talking about significant and authentic activities for our students. And going back to the diversity of students in our classes as well, some students, and I know this from experience, if you give a very open-ended kind of problem, they don't know what to do with it. They don't know where to start. They don't know how to get going. They don't know how to conceptualize the beginning of the problem. But other students, maybe who are more experienced or who are more naturally creative, they need something open-ended because they don't want to be told what to do. All they need is a starting point. So you've got these students, this diversity of students in your classes, and you have to provide for them all. So you have to have activities that are potentially open-ended, but if students need more guidance, then you have to be ready to provide guidance for students that need it to get going. And we need to teach, of course, using a variety of methods. We can't use the same pedagogy or the same methodology all the time. I know we tend to. Well, no, I shouldn't talk about you. I tend to, because I have a particular style that I feel comfortable with. So I like teaching that way. But if I keep teaching that way, I'm not appealing to the diversity of students that are in my class. So as a teacher, I have to vary my pedagogy, vary my teaching methods. And we shouldn't cover anything up for students. Even young students, they need to know why we're doing what we're doing in a class. They need to be aware and open. So as teachers, we need to be explicit about what we're doing with our students. It's not a game of tricking them to do something. We need to be very open and explicit with students about what we do. So, in other words, we need to involve students with our decision making. Now, what about thinking? This is the way students think. What can we learn from the research about student thinking that will help us as teachers? One thing we know from research is that learning takes place between the interaction of thinking and doing. So this is what our students do in class. They think about things, they conceptualize ideas, but then they need to do something with that idea. This is a model that was developed from some research in London, and the research looked at over 10,000 students' portfolios. So each of these students had developed a portfolio about the stages and steps they went through in their STEM activity. And this summarises one of the findings of the examination of 10,000 student portfolios. And the idea was that at the beginning, the student starts with some initial hazy idea. It's not a clear idea. It's just a vague idea about what a design might be or what a solution to the problem might be. In order to progress from that point, they need to go over this side and do something with that idea. So they might talk to others, make some drawings, sketches, notes, and so on. So the way students progress is by interacting between this thinking and doing something with those ideas. So this research tells us that our role as teachers is to facilitate the transition of students between thinking and doing, between having ideas and then expressing or doing something with those ideas. Then eventually we get to develop thinking and develop solutions. So as I said, the implication there for teachers is that we need to move our students between thinking and doing. That becomes the role of the teacher. But there's many impediments to us doing that. That separation of theory and practice, as teachers, we have to try and minimise that. But there's barriers to us doing that. Some schools, it's a timetabling barrier. I don't know about Hong Kong, but in Australia, it's not uncommon for students to have maybe a single class, and this is where they do their thinking. And then some other time in the week they might have a double, 2 periods together, and this is where they do their doing. The silly idea that you can separate these two things, and it's reinforcing the idea in students' minds that you can think without doing, or you can do without thinking, which is a really silly idea. Another barrier is exams, of course, and we won't get started on exams. But the barrier here is that many exams, and again, I'm not going to generalise to Hong Kong, I'm just going to talk about Australia. Many exams are a 3-hour paper and pencil test. Well, how can you test, how can you report on student learning if all they're doing is writing? Particularly in areas like STEM, where the subjects are performance-based. But in science, we want students to be inquiring. We want them to actually do things. In technology, we want students to be good designers and problem solvers. You can't do that on a piece of paper, or more advanced, even on a computer, in a 3-hour block. So these things are giving a bad message to teachers and students that somehow you can separate thinking and doing, but you can't. And the design of workspaces as well. We have classrooms and we have laboratories and workshops. As though in your classroom, that's where you think, but then when you go to the laboratory or the workshop, you just do things. You don't have to think. So sometimes that's a bad message as well, according to that research. This was some interesting research that was done in Canada with some primary school students. And the idea here of series and parallel comes from electronics. Some of you who are familiar with electronics will recognise that electronics can be in series or in parallel. So in this research, it was clear that students do not find it easy to be creative in parallel. In other words, and again I say it's common in Australia for teachers to say to their class, well, think of 4 different ideas and then we'll choose the best one, and that'll be the one that we work with. That's really, really hard for students. They can't think creatively in different directions at the same time. And what you usually end up with here is a variation of the same idea. It's just one idea, but it's 4 variations of it. This is how students work. They think creatively in series. So they have an idea, and then something needs to happen with that idea. It goes back to the first research we talked about, that moving between thinking and doing. So here's the idea, we need to do something with it, and then the idea changes. It improves, hopefully. It's a different idea. And that's the sequence of having an idea and then having some kind of intervention, some kind of activity that you do something with that idea. So again, this supports the importance of linking theory and practice, thinking and doing. We also know that extrinsic motivation is detrimental to creative practice. Creativity is one of the 21st century skills that everyone says we want our students to achieve. But unless our students are intrinsically engaged in what we do with them, it's a barrier to them developing their creativity. They need to be They need to be naturally engaged in the activities that we do with them. So the context we work within has to be interesting to them. And one way of achieving that is by ensuring that the students have a high level of choice in what we do. So ensuring student choice. I'm getting waved at that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to move a bit faster here. So, what do we know from research about student learning, how students learn, that can help us with our pedagogy? Of course, students learn best when they're interested. Everyone knows this, and yet there's still teachers who try and teach students things that they're not interested in. So we know this, but often we don't follow it. So how do we ensure student interest? The students have to own what they're doing. They contribute to what's happening in your classroom. So having open-ended briefs is a way to help ensure student engagement and motivation. Because if it's open-ended, if there's no end point, then students can choose their own end point. And when they're choosing something like that, they're invested in what they're doing. They have an invested interest in being successful and achieving their goals. So we should help our students have input also into assessment, into, if we're having them form groups, have their input into who they want to work with. Make the context real and authentic. We talked about authentic context a little while ago. I think this is the most important strategy. So if you forget everything else, and if I get told I'm out of time any minute, this is the thing to remember. That the job of the teacher is to manipulate students to the point where they think they need what you want to teach them. So you know better than your students what they need. That's why you're a teacher. You know better than your students. But they will only learn effectively if they think they need what you want to teach them. So the task of teaching is partly a task of manipulation. You're manipulating your students to the point, to the situation, you're giving them a context, an environment, so that they can come to realise, I need this information, and that's when you teach it. You teach it at the point of need. But you have to manipulate your students to get to that point. You have to give them a problem. And to solve the problem, they need what you want to teach them. It's not good enough to say, I'm teaching you this now, because next semester or next year, we're going to do a project where you need this information. That's not teaching at the point of need. That's teacher-centered teaching. That's teaching because it's easy teaching. So that means there's an appropriate time for teaching the skills that students need. So you might present support tasks for long projects. So if you've got a project that's going for a semester, then you might have short tasks that contribute to the completion of the longer task. But however you organise it, you need to provide the opportunity for immediate application. The students need to use what you're teaching them straight away, or they'll forget it and they won't learn it efficiently. It's the same for teaching new knowledge. So that was about skills, but it's the same principle for teaching new knowledge. Telling your students, I know best, is not good enough. I'm teaching you this because it's in your exam, or I'm teaching you this because we're doing a project next week where you need it, is not good enough teaching. You need to teach new knowledge when there's a need to know that new knowledge. So again, we go back to the complexity of the teaching task. Thinking about our pedagogy is not anything simple. So what are the implications for this? Well, we need to be explicit about the context within which our students are working. We need to allow them the practice of a range of skills. And we need to allow the students to have input into what they're doing. We don't tell them what to do. They have input into the processes. And I don't have time for assessment. So this is a ploy to get me invited back again. So I can finish my presentation next time. Of course, assessment is almost, it is more important than any of those other aspects. But we tend to frame assessment as something out there, something that controls us, whereas we need to take control of how we assess. So that's all I'm going to say about assessment. So I think my time's up. Thank you for that.